I took my camera and my notebooks and set off for one of the remotest places on Earth. I traveled the same rivers, visited the same villages.
Speed at the son of New York's Governor Nelson Rockefeller.
The Dutch government and the Catholic Church covered up the truth. But I found the documentation. I found personal witnesses. This is one of the great mysteries of the 20th century. And I believe I've solved it.
So, Carl, to begin, I thought I'd ask you, because this book encompasses so many journeys. There's the journey of Michael Rockefeller, there's the journey of the Asmat people, there's your journey. It's such a huge puzzle, but can you begin to talk a little bit about what you sort of pieced together?
Well, it is a long, complicated story. You know, there's no smoking gun in this story. It's an accretion of a lot of small details. I mean, the essence of it is that there were two villages, Ochinep and Amadasep, who lived about 5 miles apart, and they had been fighting each other for years. And the Asmat lived in this world of reciprocal violence, and one death always had to be balanced by another. Complicated story, but they massacred each other, and 124 guys went out in boats, and about 11 came home. And because of that, the Dutch at the time were just moving into, it was their last colony in the East, and this Dutch patrol officer named Max Lepre decided he wanted to teach them a lesson and show them that the government was powerful and that they shouldn't kill each other. So he went with, and he killed a bunch of guys, and it turned out they were incredibly important people. They weren't just anybody. They were 5 Jews, 5 longhouses, 5 clans, essentially, and the leader of each of those Jew would be the most important man in the village or in each clan, and he killed 4 out of the 5 Jew leaders of the village. And that set up this need for balance and reciprocity, and things get even more complicated, and Michael ultimately is traveling across the mouth of a river with a Dutch anthropologist in a homemade catamaran, and gets into rough water and overturns and drifts for 24 hours, and then says, I think I can make it, and is never seen again. But in reality, he swims up and just happens to swim up when there are 50 men from Ochinep, who are the men who literally replaced the Jew leaders and were related by blood to the men killed by Lepre. That's right when Michael would have swum up. And yes, I mean, the story told by the Asmat now, as well as told in the original reports, were that he swam up to them and they killed him, yeah. And went through a pretty prescribed ritual of butchering and dismembering and cannibalizing him.
And to me, it's so interesting because you're a Westerner thinking about this, reading your account. There was a part of me that went, wait, we're talking about murder here. This is murder. But then there's another part, and you go to great pains in the book to kind of talk about this. That there's this whole worldview, there's this whole gestalt that this act is a part of. And in that context, it's different.
And for the Asmat, it wasn't murder. For the Asmat, it was a sacred act that helped them restore balance to the world and allowed life to flow into the community. Right. You know, it was as fundamental to their sense of wholeness as, take your pick. I mean, watching a Redskins game or going to church or whatever it is that, having Christmas dinner, whatever it is that we Westerners do and celebrate. So for the Asmat, every incursion of the Dutch and of the priests was disrupting the very fabric of their lives. Yeah. I had these photos that Michael had taken, and Michael had been to the village before. That's why he had these photos, and they were able to identify people listed as having participated in the killing of Michael in the photo. So I knew that people listed as having killed him, he had met before, and they knew his name.
How did the journey of this book start for you?
Well, for me, I was 23 years old, the same age as Michael when I first started traveling, and it was on those journeys that I first heard about the story of Michael disappearing, and I was always just haunted by the story. As I traveled more and more, I ultimately became a journalist and traveling all over the world and to strange places, often Sudan, Congo, Afghanistan. Even those kind of crazy places were pretty benign and friendly places. And it began to occur to me that, you know, if something had happened to Michael, if he hadn't just drowned, there had to have been some weird cultural miscommunication, and that made me more and more curious, and on it went.
Yeah. And it eventually led you to this amazing research effort. And reading your book, I was just stunned trying to think about all of the interviews you must have done, the diaries and manuscripts you'd poured over, the places you'd had to go. So could you recount for us, kind of summarize the shape and the scope of the research that you did for the book?
You know, if you Googled Michael Rockefeller a couple years ago, before I got involved in the project, you know, there'd be a million hits that come up, and all these scenarios, and all of those to me had these huge holes. They all, for instance, mentioned a Dutch raid that had taken place and that had ended up killing some very important men in a village that really didn't say who those men were. It didn't say who the Dutchman was. It didn't say what organization he worked for. There was nothing. So, you know, if there's a government raid, then there have to be government documents. So I actually hired a researcher in the Netherlands. He disappeared in the western half of the island of New Guinea, which was originally a Dutch colony, is now part of Indonesian Papua. So it was a Dutch colony at the time. So Eric started going into the archives of the Dutch government and the Catholic Church, and we started finding things. I mean, one document after another. And then we found witnesses. These, you know, there were three really important people, two missionaries and another Dutch patrol officer. One of those, and who had investigated the case in great detail at the time and written long, detailed reports, reports that name names, who killed Michael, who had his skull, for instance, who had certain body parts. And they filed those reports to their superiors, both in the church and the government that said, keep those secret. And so we found all those documents, and we found those witnesses, and those witnesses told us of other, they would say, well, I filed a report to you know, the apostolic vicar, my boss, Tillemans, and he told me not to say anything. Well, that was 50 years later, an 80-year-old man saying this to me. He didn't have any of the documents with him, so we would go and look for, Eric would go into the archives, and he would look on Tillemans, and he would find there was, you know, Von Pai, the missionary's reports, and there was Tillemans' letter saying, this is secret, don't tell anything. And that went on for really a year and a half of, you know, pretty deep archival research. And those documents became what make it real. You know, it's not, for the first time, it's not a lot of conjecture, you know. It's based on real documents.
Right. Do you remember your feeling when you read those first really authoritative documents that sort of said, this is who killed Michael, this is where his bones ended up?
Yeah, it was amazing. To go to Asmat, it's a really difficult place, and it's hard to talk to them. But one night, early in my experience in Asmat, we came upon this older man, and I had not told my guide or my boatman or my translator that I was anything about Michael Rockefeller. I just said I'm a writer from America, and I want to wander around Asmat, and can you take me around? And this old man walked into a house we were staying at, and turns out he was from the village of Ochinep, and that he was in his 60s, and I couldn't help myself. I said to Amatis, ask him about if he remembers this Dutch raid when he would have been a small boy. And he remembered it, and he started telling the story. And Asmat are these wonderful storytellers. They get super graphic, and fire bows and spears. And he you know, told me the story of these people getting killed, and he named them, and I knew the names from the documents, but we had never had a discussion about the documents. Wow. I was on to something.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things you discovered in the course of your research on the ground was that you were sort of replicating the same mistakes that probably Michael Rockefeller made. Can you talk a little bit about that?
You know, for all the time that I'd spent away, I'd really been only in the village a few days at a time here and there. And, you know, I couldn't speak the language, and I was relying on a translator. I didn't know what, my translator's name was Amatis. I didn't know what Amatis was really saying or not saying. And the whole idea of cannibalism, what's cannibalism, and why were the Asmats, they're not cannibals anymore, but, you know, why were they then? All these big questions I was grappling with, so I decided I had to go back. So I found an Indonesian language teacher and worked really hard at Indonesia, Bahasa Indonesian, which is actually a fairly easy language, relatively speaking. And I found an anthropologist who I started working closely with to try to get a much deeper understanding of culture and Asmat and cannibalism. And so I went back. This is actually the village of Pirian. I spent a month in that village, which isn't even a very long time, but it was a completely different experience. And it changed everything.
Right. That to me is the really amazing thing that you did, the step that you took, to go and live with these people for a month. And when I was reading the book, I was trying to imagine, so every day for that month, we're sitting like this talking together. I don't know what you were wearing, but if I were a native, I'd be pretty much naked. I might have shorts on, maybe be smeared with pig grease or something like that. I'd probably have a big bone in my nose. I'd have some kind of cassowary headdress or something. I'd have like dog's teeth around my neck, right? This was your reality for a month. And I just tried to put myself in your head doing that.
I was really lucky because for the month coinciding with my arrival in the village, they were building a new Jew, a longhouse, a men's house. It's sort of in the Jew is the center of where all the world of living and the world of the spirits come together. And they were building a new one, and that's a time of you know, huge feasting and celebration and drumming and singing and dancing. And because they were doing all that, they were really getting decked out. And they would drum and sing for 24 hours straight, routinely. I mean, just go. You know, they would just do these beautiful, incredibly intense songs and drumming, and sometimes all night long.
Yeah. And you lived that reality. Did they accept you, and pretty much you became a part of the village?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, 1,000 times more than during my first visit. First visits when they were actually very cold, almost. I spent huge amounts of time with them, and they were pretty uninhibited around me and would ask me to photograph things and, you know, do small gestures, feed me, give me food, which were gestures of respect. But, you know, I wasn't really one of them. I never really became one of them. I mean, I think there was always a pretty big gulf between us, and I felt that gulf, and I was aware of that gulf.
Yeah.
And so there can be this incredible sort of cultural misunderstanding.
Right, which is really the theme of the puzzle that you began to put together piece by piece by piece. And one of the things you've alluded to a few times is the whole sort of spiritual world and that whole ecosystem. And I'm just wondering how you got into it yourself, how you were able to get your head into it, and then how you went about recreating it for us who don't even have the privilege of being among them as you did. How do you possibly recreate that world for people who don't know it?
Yeah, I don't know how to do that, and I don't even know. I mean, I don't want to say that I really got into it. I mean, I was always thinking about that there's a doorway here. And I mean, to be honest, I'm an atheist. I'm not a very spiritual person, but it was, you know, I knew that they had this world and that they were part of this world. You can say it was all their imaginations, but it doesn't matter. It was powerful and real to them. And, you know, I wanted to see it. I wanted to see what they saw and understand and hear what they heard, and I couldn't. But, you know, they say that the singing and the drumming is a bridge between worlds and a bridge to the ancestors. You know, you sort of let yourself go. You know, it felt very organic, really. You know, it felt like it was sort of coming from the trees and the mud. And, you know, you could lose yourself in that tribal sort of musical reverie, and it becomes sort of trance-like.
Well, I'd like to open the floor up for questions from the audience now. Right in the front here.
I know that what you described how important the spirit world and the dream world were for the Asmat. When you were talking to them and trying to get the facts of what happened, how did you manage to separate the dream world, the spirit world that was so important to them, and try to also get the facts of what happened.
If you assume that Michael never made it to shore and was never, and that was not in fact killed by the men from Ochinep, and that there was no body, and that they made all this up, you have to get into you have to create a much more complex and a much more convoluted story than the much simpler story. That's one thing. The other is that because of the documents, I had all this information about the village, and not just not just Lepre's Dutch raid, not just the government machinations from high on, but these journals from missionaries who were there. And because I had those, I could ask all these questions that were not even about Michael Rockefeller, but they were about the events surrounding Michael Rockefeller. They were about the history of the village and the structure, the political structure of the village, and who these people were that had been killed by Lepre, and who the people were who had been named as having killed Michael, and how those two groups of people were related. I think you can eliminate what the tall tales.
Let's see. Yes, right in the middle there.
When you started asking about Michael Rockefeller to the local people, what was their reaction initially? Were they willing to talk about it? Were they reticent? Because it could have been troublesome for them to admit to this murder.
It depends who you ask and where you are when you ask it. If you ask the men in either Ochinep or Pirian, about Michael Rockefeller, they get very quiet, or they'll say, you really press them. They'll say, well, we've heard the story, but we don't know anything about it. If you ask in other places in Asmat, they'll be like, oh, men in Ochinep killed him. Everybody knows that. And a lot of things are secret in Asmat, and these are forbidden stories, and these are stories you don't tell anyone, and if you tell them, you could die. The taboo on telling them is really powerful.
My last question is how this experience has changed you as a person and your sense of humanity.
The book is also, I think, a narrative of an evolving idea that I had, which was starting with sort of a very romantic and sort of uneducated idea of the primitive, and that I was fascinated by primitive people, so-called primitive people, and jungles and bows and arrows, and sort of a childlike fascination. And as I go through the book, I think I learned that that's an inadequate word, and that these are incredibly complicated people, and I had this fantasy of kind of bonding with them, actually, because I feel a little bit like an outsider in normal life, and I've always felt that way since I was a child, and there's always been a tension of sort of wanting to belong, but not, and wanting to stay away from the group, and that's a constant tension. So I sort of had this idea that I would go to this place and be kind of one with the that I would find a sense of community with those people that I didn't find in my own life. And it's not really like that. I mean, I'm just this white guy in this world, and I barely speak their language, and that was completely naive of me. And we were incredibly different, and I didn't really, I could never belong in the world of Asmat.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for transporting us with you tonight.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the time. Thank you.